As Anna said, my name is Clare Smith. I'm an Assistant Director at Leeds Teaching Hospital. I was delighted when Jackie contacted me to ask whether or not I would participate in this event. Clearly, by the number of people that are here and the amount by which it was oversubscribed, this is a network that's both wanted and also needed. Whilst I was actually delighted that she'd contacted me, I was somewhat nervous and I was also extremely anxious, predominantly because I haven't had a particularly conventional route through to the post that I'm holding at the moment. I've had a variety of jobs in my life, and I've made it difficult for myself by some of the early choices that I've made, which I'll talk about in a short while. I've ranged from working in a cafe, to being a cleaner, to being in the army, to being a tour guide to the Vatican. I've done a variety of different roles. I know that we're all a sum total of our experiences, and so I won't be any different from anybody else in that regard. But some of the choices I made really have affected how I've now gone through my career, and the fact that I've kind of made it a little bit hard for myself. The first job I had was actually when I was 14 years old. I was bundled off to the Isle of Man for the summer holidays to work in a cafe called the Singing Kettle Cafe, and it's in Douglas near the pier. So I was 14 years old. I had to be at work from 5 o'clock in the morning to make 500 sandwiches by 7:30 in the morning in order to meet the contract for my employer. And I loved it. I really loved it. I was 14 years old. I was away from home on my own. I was independent. I was self-reliant, and it was great. And I did that for 2 further years after that first period. But what was really difficult for me was, having been that independent, self-reliant 14-year-old, to go back to school and be a schoolgirl again. I found that almost impossible, and I think my teachers found it so as well. So much to my parents' absolute horror, I left school halfway through my A-levels. I didn't complete my A-levels. I think my dad was really worried that I was going back to making sandwiches for the rest of my life, and I effectively was told by my dad, and this probably seems quite remarkable really, I was told by my dad that I had 2 options. I could either join the Metropolitan Police Cadets, or I could join the Army. Considering I was such an independent, self-reliant individual, I joined the Army. After my basic training, I went through, and I eventually ended up as a special intelligence analyst in the British Forces. Just to make this work. I wasn't a natural soldier. I'm not a natural athlete, and certainly I'm absolutely shocking on a set of monkey bars. I just can't do it. But what I was able to do, and what a skill I was able to develop, was working with information and working with intelligence and make it meaningful for the individuals that needed to use it, for the senior officers that actually needed to make very important decisions about deployment of personnel and so on and so forth. I developed a level of self-discipline or personal discipline around learning that I had never had before, and I found I enjoyed it. I realised actually there was more up here than I'd ever given myself credit for. But one of the things that I really disliked about the army was being shouted at. It probably seems you're in the army, you're going to be shouted at, and yes, there are occasions where you need to be told off. You know, I once lost my the firing pin for my rifle when I was cleaning it once, so it wouldn't go. So you can imagine that you get shouted at for something like that. But what I didn't like is being shouted at, or watching other people being shouted at by individuals just because they could, because that was their position. When I'm talking about this shouting, I'm not talking about bellowing at somebody at the back of the room. I'm talking about being so close to someone's face that you can actually feel the spit on it. I got to points when I was in the forces when I was actually felt the lowest of the low, particularly after I sustained an injury for which I ended up leaving the army. I promised myself when I got to that point that I would never ever put myself in a position again where people could speak to me, or where I would allow people to speak to others in such a terrible way just because of their position. I thought the only way I'm actually going to be able to do that, the only way I'm going to be able to elevate myself to be able to do that is actually to go back into education. So when I left the army, I went back as a mature student. I paid my way. I had pretty much full-time job, but overnight and at weekends to get through. I made that promise to myself that I wouldn't just idly stand by and watch people's dignity be impacted on in that way, that people felt questioned their own individual value because of the way that they were performing at work. And I've tried to stay true to that, so much so that it's been to my own cost at times. I just want to share something with you. Jackie said I could be as personal as I wanted to be, but I just want to share an experience that I've had relatively recently. It was before I came to LTHT. I was in a senior post in a Scottish board and got a new employer. He started 9 months before I left post. And in my first one-to-one with him, I asked him, how do you affect change? What tools do you use to bring about long-lasting change? And he said, fear. He said, I find people work a lot harder when they think their job's at risk. I found that abhorrent, and I told him that, and I left that organisation quite quickly thereafter. Just to go back to being in the forces again, it's an interesting place. Naturally, because of the type of work it is, it's not a particularly female-dominant environment. And at the time I was in post, it was just at the time when the Women's Royal Army Corps was coming to an end. So it used to be Women's Royal Army Corps, and then suddenly you just became a soldier, in with the boys, everything was as was. And what I observed was that some of the women found that transition extremely difficult, extremely so. There was, I'm going to generalise a little bit, so I do apologise for that, but there was a cohort of women that basically assumed the role of being a man, really, in that environment. And the disappointing thing about that was that there was actually no need, and they weren't thought any better of by being so. The other cohort, and again, generalisation, were those that lined themselves up to be women in the army. And I think, although they ran the risk of being considered overly soft or not quite up to it or whatever, I think they were the ones that I would probably nail my baton to. After I left the army, I went to university. I did well. I managed to get a bursary to go and study for a master's in Rome. I was over there for 2 years. I lived in a convent for a short while over there whilst I was studying, but also that's where I did my tour guiding of the Vatican and so on and so forth. When I came back from living in Rome, after a short while, I took a job as a bursar in a very successful and oversubscribed school in Leeds. To be honest, that was the first time really I've gone, I'm starting to make it. It started to feel as though I was on a career path rather than just having a series of jobs. I was in the senior management team. It was an all-male senior management team until I trotted on in. It was an exciting time for me. I thought I was on the way up. I was reporting to the governors. I was part of the senior management team. I was on a master's in my spare time, studying business. I thought this is going well. And then a colleague of mine attended one of the senior management team meetings and sent me a card immediately after she'd been to that meeting. I hope you can read that. It's a little bit faint, but it says, "That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it." Now, I'm imagining many of you have actually experienced that at some stage in your own careers. What I actually hadn't realised, or perhaps I just chosen not to realise it, is that being that first female member of that senior management team, there were many occasions when I was at that meeting and I would have an active contribution to make, but it was kind of glossed over. Or even worse, that the comment or contribution I'd made was picked up slightly later on, restated and run with. I really hadn't appreciated it until that point, but as soon as that card came through, it really mattered to me. It really, really mattered to me. How do I turn this round so that I can continue to move forward and I can prove myself to be that credible female leader in this environment? And I thought long and hard about how I do that. Do I go up to my boss and say, you know, this isn't very fair, I'm making all this contribution and it's only being picked up? And I didn't want to do that because I was actually really worried I was going to come across as a really needy female. So I thought I'm going to have to find a different way of working with this. So I came up with a workaround. I would, if I had a particular contribution I wanted to make, I would go and meet with individuals beforehand and basically warm them up. So that when we got into the meeting, people were aware. They didn't always agree with me, but they were aware of what I was going to be talking about, and predominantly that the points were picked up and were taken forward. I didn't have to do that for very long. After a short while, I built my own credibility, and therefore, when I opened my mouth, people, you know, didn't tend to ignore it. But should I have compromised to that degree? Should I have done a workaround? Why should I guess? But well, then again, that's what's so wonderful about women in the workplace. We're so adaptable. We do as we need to do to be able to actually to get on. After a while at the school, it was a good sort of 4 or 5 years, I moved to Scotland and eventually took my first post in the NHS. My first role was as a unit operational manager, and which is the equivalent of a general manager here at LTHT. It was a really difficult first couple of days for me. Considering that earlier on I spoke about putting myself in a position where nobody could shout at me again, I was at day 2, phone rang, picked up the phone, and there was a cardiothoracic surgeon bellowing down the phone at me. So I thought, have I made the right choice here? But it went well, and after 3 years I was promoted to being a divisional general manager. I'm wafting my thingy around, that's right. I was promoted to being a divisional general manager, and I was aligned to the medicine division, and I also ran a district general hospital for a short time as well. It was after about a year of being in that post that I was asked to participate in an expert working group on unscheduled care for the Scottish Government, and I presented at national conference on that as well, and it was a hugely satisfying experience for me. But the most satisfying experience I've had in the workplace really was what came after that. Grampian, where I worked, were very fortunate to receive £120 million worth investment on a new build, and we built the emergency care centre there. I had the privilege of working with a clinical director called Nick Fluck, who's actually a nephrologist, and he's probably one of the most inspirational people I've ever worked with in terms of how he just goes about his general business. And going back to what Yvette says about everybody is a leader in an organisation, he was truly inspirational. We agreed right from the outset when we were trying to make this building operationally ready for patients that we were not going to lift old models of care into the new build. I mean, they weren't working in the old environment, so why would we think that they would work in the new environment? So we went through a period of change involving the clinicians who were absolutely intrinsic to this, because otherwise it just wouldn't work. And we redesigned pretty much every single pathway in there, whether it be access to diagnostics, the speed of diagnostics, or even how we moved dirty and clean linen around the building in order to improve the experience of our patients. The day that building opened, as I say, was professionally the most rewarding experience I've ever had, and I was so proud. I was so proud of the team and the amount of effort that they put into it. But whilst I was doing that piece of work, I came to realise my own thresholds for pressure. I've worked in pressurised environments before then, but that was really when I really felt it. I came to recognise in myself sort of 3 zones of pressure, really. So my comfort zone is where I'm bobbing along and I'm all nice and happy, and I'm pretty much doing things that I've done before, which may have been hard the first time, but when you do it the second, third and fourth time, they're not quite so difficult. And then the stretch zone. So that's when I was doing some of that work, when I was slightly unfamiliar with the environment, and it feels slightly uncomfortable and a bit of a challenge, a bit like this really. And that's where I like to operate. I know you need a bit of a mix, but that's actually where I like to operate. It kind of makes my blood pump around my body, make me want to come to work. The next bit, the panic zone, which is where it just feels out of control really. You feel under so much pressure that you start to make poor decisions and poor choices. There were a couple of times when we were doing the work around the emergency care centre where I know I slipped into there, and having to sort of like correct some of the decisions that I made took time. But I wasn't there for long, and I was able to bring myself out, and I also now I'm able to recognise when I need to just ask for help. There is nothing wrong with just asking for help if it starts to feel too much. There's something else about the panic zone which I think really resonates for me. A relatively recent experience for me has been working with an individual who is always in that zone. And it's difficult. They create a whirlwind around them that kind of sucks everybody in, and it's hard to step out. And I think sometimes what I've learned from that is having the bravery to be able to just step back and say, no, that's just not working for me. I came back down to Leeds at end of January and started working at LTHT as Assistant Director of Operations. It's a new role, it's in a new structure with a relatively new executive team, and certainly the role that I'm in is still going through a period of bedding in. But it's professionally a hugely exciting time for me, and the opportunities are hugely exciting. One of the things that's quite remarkable about having come down to Leeds is this is the first time I've ever had a female boss. Never had a female boss before. So I've been working for 24 years since I left the basic training in the army, and I've never had a female line manager before, and I find that really quite remarkable. I've worked with some very successful and some very capable women, and it's been extremely rewarding doing so. But there is something about having that sort of line management coaching, mentoring contact that really is important. And if you can't get that from your line manager, then I would strongly recommend that we look to other avenues to enable you to get that sort of access. It's extremely valuable. I don't think as a culture of, I don't think necessarily the NHS is always all that brilliant at encouraging mentorship and coaching. Although at Leeds, considering this is the first place I've got a coach, I think that might be slightly different. I had an employer once who told me that every job that you do, you should always be thinking about your next one. So anything that you carry out in your current role, it should be because you're thinking about the next job and lining yourself up for the next post. I don't necessarily agree with the full sentiment of that, but what I do think is that you do have to think ahead in terms of where you want to go in order to be able to inform the choices that you make. I'm a bit of a spade is a spade type of a girl, and one of the things I struggle with, other than self-belief really, is the shadow side of organisations and organisational politics. I find that quite difficult really to cope with. I spoke to a female colleague who has similar sorts of feelings to me, and she recommended that I actually got a coach. So I contacted Organisational Learning. I said, please can I have a coach, and Organisational Learning facilitated that for me. I wish I'd done it years ago. I honestly wish I'd done it years ago. It's made such a difference. It was a bit like a first date when I met him, actually. It was, does he like me? Do I like him? Is it going to work? And it worked. It's worked really well. And we've agreed between us that I'm going to focus on organisational behaviour and organisational politics. I've seen some really poor behaviours both in and out of the NHS. I've seen out-and-out positioning, I've seen backbiting, and I've seen bullying, and I don't want to be part of that. I want the organisations I work for to succeed, but I'm not going to compromise myself in order to make that happen. And I think this coaching is enabling me to recognise the fact that actually you don't need to. My coach and I have had a number of conversations about whether or not there is this sort of anxiety that I have around organisational politics is because of the weighting of the number of men that are in senior posts, because they direct to a degree, the culture of an organisation. So is it because there's not enough women in the boardroom why a lot of cultures, not LTHT, but why a lot of cultures in NHS organisations are quite so poor? We've had a few heated debates about this. He thinks that's actually the case. But are we actually saying that until we get more females in the boardroom, that ambitious and capable women can't proceed because they don't want to behave like that, they don't want to be part of that culture, and that their own self-belief that they will be able to survive in that sort of culture has been knocked back? I really hope that's not the case. As women leaders, it's absolutely fine to want pace. It's absolutely fine to be unapologetic about wanting to succeed, and it's absolutely fine to hold people to account. But what we don't need to do, I feel, is give up what makes us us, what makes women in the workplace such a valuable asset. My coach said to me, there is no such thing as a glass ceiling, it's only actually in my head. He asked me, am I so unconvinced by my own capabilities that I won't be able to affect organisational change if I got a promoted post? Am I so, my moral compass, is it so weak that when I move to a different organisation, if I get a promoted post, that I will suddenly revert to behaving like that? Is that the case? No. Otherwise I would have unlearned everything I've learned over the last 24 years. So, to get through that glass ceiling, I'm going to have to take it one chip at a time, but I've already got my hammer and I'm already working on it. Thank you very much.